1940 and 1941. Many people felt that Britain was on the edge of invasion throughout this period of time. At the outbreak of the war, 38 million gas masks had been distributed because there was a wide expectation that the Germans would use gas bombs, picking up on the big use of chemical warfare in the First World War. And of course, there was the fear of invasion. And I have to tell you this anecdote about my good old mum, who was in school during the Second World War, came home one day from school, and she must have been, I don't know, about 9 or 10. And she ran into the kitchen where my grandmother was, and she said, "Mummy, Mummy, Mummy, I've just seen a German." And so my grandmother, who was pretty unflappable, said, "Oh, really, darling, how do you know he was German?" And she said, "Well, he flashed me. He was a dirty old man with a raincoat who had flashed her," and she said, "No English gentleman could possibly do such a thing, so he must be a German." My mum lived in the south of England, where people were truly expecting the Germans to, appear on their front doorstep at any moment. So there's a real sense that Britain itself was a potential battleground. This required a whole-scale mobilization of the domestic population in Britain. That is to say that the British people had to be mobilized to support the war effort, because it was going to be happening all around them. And this meant that the government invested huge resources in both following public opinion and trying to lead and direct it. So it's really during the Second World War that you get the development of large-scale public opinion polling and market research and social investigation in Britain. The opinions and concerns of the British people were mapped in an unprecedented type of way. So you had the Mass Observation Organisation was hired by the government to continue its work, the British Institute of Public Opinion, the BBC, and the Wartime Social Survey, which was surveying a peak of around 31,000 families by the middle of the 1940s. You also had the Ministry of Information producing propaganda films intended to that built on people's concerns and tried to build morale. Okay? Morale was a key concept for the British in the Second World War. It was widely believed that if the morale of the people broke, that Germans would win the war. So the government invested a good deal of time in trying to keep the morale of the people high and trying to find new ways of measuring and assessing it. These propaganda movies, almost to a film, portrayed the British people as active defenders of the war effort. Okay? That's to say that the very group of people who you heard about on Tuesday, who everyone thought, oh my God, they're interested in mass culture, they're escapist, they're only interested in trivial things, they're somehow culturally debased, they're so, they're passive in the way in which they consume this stuff, suddenly get flipped round. Suddenly they're seen to be active, dutiful, responsible citizens who can take charge of the war effort. And more importantly, that new sense of the working class as active agents in history, as people who can make history happen, was then connected to a new political agenda. This wasn't just going to be about a fight against fascism. It was going to be a fight for a better order. It was going to be a fight so that what happened after the First World War wouldn't happen again. That these people wouldn't come back to the promise of homes fit for heroes and end up unemployed for 2 decades. Okay? Instead, they were going to build a new type of democratic form of social justice. So George Orwell famously described Dunkirk as the English Revolution, okay? And said this is a quiet English revolution. The military generals had fucked up, and it was the British people in these types of little flotillas of ships who went over to Dunkirk to rescue our boys that were being bombed on the beach. It's the people who came to the rescue of the elite who had messed up. Okay? And Orwell said, okay, so now we have to build on this mood, and we now have to say we're not just fighting fascism, we're fighting for a better future. We're fighting for a people's peace. So at the heart of the government's attempt to mobilize people and to keep their morale high was a new type of social contract. That is to say that the government began to say that the war effort was going to be based on a new sense of equality amongst the people of the country. That everyone would have to make sacrifices, and everybody would have to deal with the limited resources that Britain had. Essentially, this can be summed up in two phrases: equality of sacrifice, we're all going to suffer together, and fair shares for all. Everybody will get what is due to them. Okay? That's a radically different type of political message than that had been apparent in the 1920s and the 1930s. At the heart of this propaganda effort were many of the very people that I was talking about on Tuesday who have been engaged in the new types of cultural projects at the BBC, in the documentary at film movement, in the Left Book Publishing, and all of this. And I'm going to play you one example now, which is a propaganda movie called The Heart of Britain, directed by Humphrey Jennings, who was a filmmaker but had also been one of the founders of mass observation in 1937. And as it's not available digitally, I have to do it in good old...
The winds of war blow across the hills and moorlands of Yorkshire and Derbyshire. They stir the grasses in the sheep valleys of Cumberland and ruffle the clear surface of Ullswater. They sing in the cathedral towers of Durham, in the Tower of Liverpool, still building, in the spires of Coventry. But the heart of Britain remains unmoved and unchangeable. In the shadow of the hills lives a great industrial people, thronging the valleys of power and the rivers of industry. In Black Sheffield, the flames of the steel furnaces scorch the men's faces night and day. At the end of a shift, one of the first hands, George Good, comes off hot and tired, but nowhere near beaten and nowhere near through. He's not only a steel worker, he's an air raid warden as well.
Well, Albert, I've had a rough shift today, but never mind. I've got a good dinner to go home to. After that, I'm going on ARP duty.
From Yorkshire to Lancashire, from steel to cotton. All day long, the looms are weaving poplin for export, to pay for arms from over the Atlantic. But all night now, there must be men to watch for firebombs, men to stay on the job.
Yes, there's two of us on every night. Fire watch party. Immediately the siren goes, we go on top. Of course, we keep our eyes scattered around, don't we?
Yeah.
The man at the fire station has been training the youngsters to put out these incendiary bombs. They seem quite good at it. In fact, I've seen one of them that size, and she was very good at the job, too.
This used to be the playground of a school. Now it's one of the places where Liverpool trains her rescue squads. Behind this grim work lie an infinite number of patient, everyday tasks for the women. dull jobs like typing lists of addresses, unending ones like sorting clothes for the homeless, routines which women fill with love and devotion, and the simplest, most difficult task of all, just staying put with the war round the corner. On a hazy day, Jerry comes droning over about 3 miles up. When the roof spotters think he means trouble, they send the mill girls down to shelter for a few minutes. Just look at these Lancashire lasses cowering before the Luftwaffe. These are the folk whom Field Marshal Goering hoped to bomb into capitulation. But in Manchester today, they still respect the genius of Germany, the genius of the Germany that was. Here in Coventry, those everyday tasks of the women came right through the fire and became heroic. Listen to Mrs. Hyde.
You know, you feel such fools standing there in a crater, pitch darkness of night, and holding mugs of tea. You see the men bringing out bodies. You feel useless until you know that there's someone there, actually in that bombed house, who's alive, and you can give that tea to. And then to hear the praises of the men themselves. They say, that tea is jolly good. I've just washed the blood and dust out of my mouth. And we feel that we really have done a job, and a useful job.
And even now in Yorkshire, the people find the time to sing. People who sing like that in times like these cannot be beaten. These people are slow to anger, not easily roused. Now, they and their mates, their wives and their children have been subjected to the most savage ordeal ever inflicted upon human beings.